Hello everybody, my name is Dranos and welcome to this video I'm taking from my stream of Underrot plus 22. I did with my buddies last week at the time of recording this. So this was back when the affixes were Tyrannical, Teeming, Volcanic, and Void, which was a pretty fun week actually for Underrot in particular, not a bad week for this dungeon. You really only have to deal with one Void Emissary, and that's only if you get unlucky. So we started off with this pretty big pull here. We didn't want to use our Bloodlust, and we didn't want to deal with a Maggot in this pull, so we sapped it before we started, and then we moved right into this pull with Matron and 5 Trolls. The reason I don't like doing the Maggot with this pull is that the Matron's Warcry will cause its cast to be very quick, and it's very hard to reliably interrupt it if you have somebody watching it really hard to make sure that they're going to be able to stop it from doing its Bile cast. Then you'll run into this problem where that person isn't doing a lot of damage to this whole group. And as you can see here, we did quite a lot of damage as a group to nuke down all those targets at once. Now, unfortunately, with Void Week and Underrot, there's this RNG as to which side the Void Touched Emissary is on, as well as which of the two pathways has extra Matrons on it. And if those are on the same side, you can just go down the other side immediately, and it's very good. But if they're on different sides, then you need to wait for this patrol this week. So here we just AFK'd for 30 seconds waiting for this patrol to go away so that we could go into this Void Touched Emissary without having the patrol ad, because if that patrol comes during the fight, it's really problematic. There's not good spots near this Void Touched Emissary to line of sight. So we're just going to have to, we just decide to kill it by itself and let the patrol go its own way. And this way we don't have to worry too much about dying. This adds maybe a minute and a half to the timer, which maybe in a 23, that would be the difference between timing the key and not timing it. Or maybe in a 24. I don't know where the keystone level is where that's going to make the difference, but definitely on Void Week, that RNG probably is worth a keystone level at some point. Let's take a moment to talk about our composition, because this is a little bit of a weird comp, right? If you've been following my channel, I've been making a lot of tier list videos recently, talking about how you don't want more than one B tier or below spec in your group or whatever. And here I am playing with all specs that I rated in or below the B tier in my final tier list. So we have the Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is a spec that I noted is extremely tanky, but doesn't do all that much damage. But then combined with that, we have the Discipline Priest, and that's actually a really good combo I've been noticing. I did keys for a day with these two people, and on these two specs. Normally Ardent Censor plays Shadow, but here he was playing Disc so that we could do these keys. And Evade also plays Havoc, but has been playing Vengeance recently and having a lot of fun with it. And this composition, the two specs actually really complement each other nicely. Evade is very able to not die outside of specific times where his cooldowns are down, and he doesn't have access to Metamorphosis or Demon Spikes, and in those times, Pain Suppression goes a long way to saving him. And outside of those times, he really doesn't need all that much healing, which is good, because Disc has a problem with healing him, or has a problem with healing some tank specs. So this pull is not one that you'll see a lot of groups do. That's because the Befouled Spirit is very lethal if it ever gets any casts going off. However, with an Outlaw Rogue in the group, I'm able to just keep it stunned, gouged, and then Fact is able to kill it with Combustion before it does even anything all that problematic. We could have kept it under control for maybe another 15 seconds with my Gouge, my Blind. You'll see I use Vanish Cheap Shot there on it as well to keep it controlled. This pull is something that I would only recommend if you are sure that you can keep that mask from doing a dark, like from channeling on anybody for an amount of time. But if you can do that, it's pretty good count. And it means that you get to save your Shroud, which is good because we have a plan for what we're going to do with our Shroud. Now we're going into this first boss here. Our comp is pretty good at boss damage. Again, let's talk a little bit more about the comp. So we talked about the tank and the healer, and then because our healer isn't a Resto Druid, we don't have good control for Tides Emissaries and Enchanted Emissaries by default. So that's why we have this Windwalker in here. Cynic playing as Windwalker is going to be really effective at letting us Ring of Peace to control both Tides and Enchanted Emissaries. So that's covering a hole in the composition. And then we have Facts playing this Fire Mage. Fire Mage, very huge damage spec that also benefits from the fact that Evade is bringing that Chaos brand. We actually have both the Monk debuff and the Demon Hunter debuff in this group, so everybody's damage is getting buffed there, which is pretty cool. You'll see Evade here just going to tank a lot of the casts of Blood Bolt from the boss. That one just going right through on him, and really doesn't do all that much of anything. Evade's strategy on this fight is just to let the boss cast on him, and he'll have Fiery Brand on it when it does get a cast through, and it's not going to do all that much damage to him. And then all we need to do is make sure that we kick all of the ad casts. It's a little bit different than a normal strategy you'll see on this boss. That when you're not playing with like a Vengeance Demon Hunter, often the tank will want you to kick the boss as a priority and maybe let some ad casts go through. But due to the way that Fiery Brand works as his shield wall against one target, Evade has us do the opposite on this fight. which is good because, again, the amount of kicks we have in this group is a little bit limited because we have a ranged DPS in the group. If we were all melee, we'd be able to just kick all the casts from these two targets, but because we have facts in here playing as mage, some of the casts are going to go through, and that's why it's very good that we have access to evade surviving those hits. Also worth noting, if you were playing a protection warrior in this comp, that you also wouldn't have to have any of the casts go through because they'd have access to spell reflect against some of the casts. But yeah, you can see evade actually dropping a little bit low there, as some of the casts do end up going through on him, but not dying and not in too much danger of dying. He does have a cheat death as well, so as long as his cheat death isn't procced, he's allowed to play a little bit less, a little bit more riskily, and just kind of rely on getting some procs. He's playing this build of Vengeance Demon Hunter that's focused around the Gluttony talent and the Vision of Perfection essence that is all about proccing these metas, and while he's in those meta procs, he's extremely tanky. The unfortunate drawback of this, again, is that he's a pretty low damage tank, right? If you see in the bottom, he's doing 20k on this boss fight, but the Disc Priest is coming in big, doing 35k DPS here. Now, any healer spec can do a lot of damage on this boss fight in particular, but Ardent is going to continue doing heavy damage to bosses, even when there's also healing to be done, which there wasn't really on that fight. Okay, so now this week we're doing something cool here. There's a Void over on the left, so we decided that we were going to Shroud around to the right because fighting Void emissaries is one of the best things to cut out of your route, if at all possible. Also, due to our composition, we have 2 disease dispels, so we can fight 5 lashers at once, and we'll just let some of the casts go through. I also can cloak the one on me there. Again, you'll see I'm turning around, throwing a stun, throwing some pistol shot in between the eyes stuns and slows at the Enchanted Emissary because we don't have a Resto Druid to control it. And so that's kind of one of the best things to do is just while I've got my Blade Flurry turned on, I'm helping to control that Enchanted Emissary, keep it from getting too close. You can technically, as an Outlaw Rogue, even let it get a little bit closer and just kind of Blade Flurry it away. But that sometimes runs the risk of letting that aura touch the lashers, and that can cause people to die. So it's not a risk that I think is generally worth taking. I like to keep the Enchanted Emissary far enough away that people aren't scared. Because even then, if people get scared of it, they will then use their own abilities to knock it back, and that is a damage loss. So I think it's a overall damage gain and survivability gain generally to keep the Enchanted Emissary at least 10 yards away from letting that aura connect with anything. Okay, so we're on to this room. This room, the kind of general rule is never pull more than one Bloodswarmer at once, and make sure that whatever combination of Lashers and Maggots you control, you have abilities lined up for. The Outlaw Rogue is fantastic at this room. Outlaw Rogues can handle multiple different jobs here, but the main one that Outlaw Rogue is great at is the Maggot, because every other breath can be handled with Gouge, and then if your Gouge is not up for one of them, you can control it with Vanish Cheap Shot, with Blind, or with Between the Eyes stuns if they're coming up in your rotation, and all those happen pretty often. Outlaw Rogue also good at Bloodswarmers, can do the Between the Eyes stun for a nice long time on the Bloodswarmer, as you can see there. So Between the Eyes the Bloodswarmer, Gouge the Maggot. It's really useful to have a focus set up on your character here, so you want a button that sets your target as your focus, and then you want other buttons that you can use to gouge your focus, kick your focus, or whatever, and that way you can do multiple things at once on these pulls. In some of these pulls, I'm even kicking a Lasher, stunning a Bloodswarmer, and gouging a Maggot, all within a couple globals of each other, and that's a really useful thing that the Outlaw Rogue utility is bringing, and that's giving us the cover we need to let Fax just sit back there and activate his Combustion and his Rune of Power and do 200,000 DPS to this pack, and completely delete them from existence. Fax also does bring some good utility as a Fire Mage here. Dragon's Breath is a stop for the Maggot if I ever need it. I'm calling for him to Dragon's Breath as, whenever my Gouge is down and it would be inconvenient for me to use a different ability to stop it, or if I'm kiting a Bloodswarmer, for instance, I'm calling for Fax to take care of it with the Dragon's Breath in those instances, and that's a good thing that they bring. Now, the Bloodswarmer on me here, I do have access to Cloak of Shadows and Parry normally, but I've already used those on previous Bloodswarmers and at the start of this Bloodswarmer cast. Bloodswarmers, when they're fixated on you, do a combination of magic and physical damage, so both of those abilities are useful at preventing it. If you choose, you can also just kite them. The way it works is that they'll charge you if you're too far away from them, but you can kind of stand in this dead zone where you're backpedaling away from them slowly and you're 10 yards away, and they're too far away to hit you, but they're also not far away enough to want to charge at you. And so you can avoid taking any damage at all from them if you choose to do that. Again, my biggest advice for you is if they're slowed, it's pretty safe to just backpedal away from them. Otherwise, you kind of need to do this strafe, stop strategy to keep your speed at the right speed to be kiting them. It's better if you can to avoid doing that because we'd rather expose the Bloodswarmers to the AoE damage. We don't want the Bloodswarmer to be out of the group generally because that means that it's not going to be hit by all the Ignite, all the Flame Strike, all the Blade Flurrying. So usually, especially on Tyrannical weeks, it's pretty important to make sure that the Bloodswarmer stays in the group. Again, on Tyrannical weeks, this trash is still pretty lethal, but it's important that we don't lose too much time doing it because the boss fights take a very long time. So we can't afford to pull slowly here because it is Tyrannical. Now, we are pulling a Tides here. Our group is not particularly good at dealing with the Tides for a long amount of time. The one thing we have access to is Facts spamming Polymorph on it, which is what he is going to do to this Tides. He's going to cast a Polymorph on it every couple globals. If we need to, if he calls for it or whatever, if he's fixated by a Bloodswarmer and can't cast his Polymorph, we can handle it with other abilities. We can briefly cover it, but the main plan is for him to just spam that Polymorph on it while we take care of the rest of the pull. The Tides, you can maybe let it in here. Like, we could let it in and it wouldn't be that bad. The Maggot is the most problematic thing with the Tides in, but it is dodgeable by the rest of the group. And then the Lasher, we could just dispel whoever gets targeted, because again, we have 2 disease dispels in this group. And the other stuff, the Bloodstorm, we just wouldn't be able to stun, which is fine. Like you can see here, targets me. We don't even need to use a dispel there because I can see it's targeting me, so I use Cloak. And that way I pre-immune the stun there. Now that we've handled most of the difficulty of this pull, Evade decides it's time to pull some more. So we got this Death Speaker in here. Ring of Peace is used as a pseudo interrupt there. Ring of Peace is a really useful way to kick an important ability on a mob while it's in a Tides aura, although unfortunately that Raised Dead does recast there, so it doesn't handle it for long enough, and we do get an extra skeleton here. These extra skeletons spawned by Raised Dead aren't the end of the world. They don't give count though. And so if it happens at a bad time, it can be really slowing. Here, it's not going to slow us too much because there are a bunch of Guardians that we're cleaving down anyway. Cleaving down one more of them isn't the end of the world. We don't have a Soothe in our group either. Soothe is normally really useful on these pulls because it removes the Enrage, the Wicked Frenzy from these mobs. You can see here there's a really unfortunate overlap as well. The Tides Emissary is teleporting away, and so there's no way to knock it back or whatever, while the Death Speaker is there in its aura, so we do get another Guardian here that we're going to have to cleave down. That's okay, though. The main thing we're doing now is killing this one Void-Touched Emissary. There's really no way around this Void-Touched Emissary unless you're an Alliance group. You basically just have to kill it. If you're in an Alliance group, you can just walk past it and Shadow Meld, and I hate you. But here in the Horde, victory or death, Loktar Urgar, we got to kill all the Void Emissaries. That's the rule. There is line of sight over behind these little pillars, but it's a little bit far away. This is another one of those awkward Void Emissaries that there's not easy line of sight next to. So it is one of the ones that takes a little bit while longer to pull. Depending on what's happening, you can maybe pull it with the Death Speaker next to it. But that really means that the tank may need to be kiting, depending on how Wicked Frenzy pans out. So we elected instead to pull the Skeletons first and the Void later, once the Death Speaker was dead. This is a Void that doesn't pull. If you pull the right skeleton, the skeleton that is farthest away from that emissary, it will not aggro the Void. So you can get in combat with the Skeletons without getting in combat there. Here I made a mistake. Evade was planning to Fear Sigil the Horror and then run past it and break it out right around now, and I accidentally started attacking it. That was not something that I did a bad thing there, basically. But it's okay. It didn't end up, turning around and one-shotting anybody or anything. The Horror needs to be kicked on all the Death Bolt casts, which actually it's something that Outlaw Rogue is again pretty good at. An Outlaw Rogue can basically solo that worm with all the same abilities that handle a Maggot. You can just go stun. You can go like kick into gouge, into stun, into another stun with Vanish Cheap Shot, into your kick, into your gouge again, and then by that time the Horror's dead. So you can actually pull other stuff onto Horrors if you have an Outlaw Rogue in your group, although many groups prefer not to do this because there's a lot of... You can usually space out all the hard mobs to interrupt here and just do them at different times with Skeletons, and that's kind of what we do, is we keep pulling Skeletons onto different priority mobs and just let the Skeletons slowly get cleaved down. The Defiler is a mob that has 3 abilities, only 2 of which need to be kicked. There's the Withering Curse and the Shadow Bolt Volley, and both of those it's vital that you kick those in a high key. But in a lower key, it's not that important, and their final ability, Summoning a Totem, is not important to kick at all. You can let that go through, and you see here we just let that go through, and you just walk away from the totem, and nothing bad happens. In some cases, you may want to kick the totem if you're confined to a tight space, and if you have extra kicks available. So in some spots, it's worth, like if you have an extra kick, to call it out to be on the totem. But normally that's not something you need to worry too much about. Anyways, the reason we were moving forward and not engaging Cragmaw here is that we really wanted to have Bloodlust available for Cragmaw. Cragmaw on Tyrannical, even on Fortified, but especially on Tyrannical, it's vital that you have maximum DPS for it, because the longer this fight takes, the more tantrums you're going to get. So it takes even longer. Like if you add an extra 20% health to this boss, it takes more than 20% longer because you get this good long first phase to deal damage to it, and then after that, the phases are short. So you want to minimize the amount of short phases and minimize the amount of tantrums that you have to deal with, not only because it's bad for the healer, but also because that's just time where you're not doing effective damage. So this is a really good one to make sure that everybody has all their cooldowns for, and they come in with everything that they need. It looks like we didn't actually have like combustion on pull available here, but it looks like combustion is still going to be in the Bloodlust, and that's really the most important thing. Again, it's a pretty long phase here, so you see Fax is still going to be able to get his whole combustion in before the boss phase is there. We had a couple ticks spawn on that first charge, I think, because mostly people were just in their cooldowns or whatever and didn't want to move to stomp on them. That was a little sloppy. That kind of thing could be a big problem, but it wasn't too bad here. Now, tantrums are coming out, and these are very, very, very bad in a tyrannical key, especially like Discipline Priest is actually one of the better specs at healing this, although their barrier is not a particularly useful cooldown against it because you have to be moving. But it's nice that their Rapture is a really good cooldown against that. And outside of that, it can be very lethal to people. So it's important to make sure that you have health stones available and health potions for this. One of the things that people were often mentioning in my tier list was how valuable health stones are that Warlocks bring. But it's worth noting that Warlocks don't add a health stone to this fight. You already have access to a health stone on this fight, just by the fact that you can get a Warlock ult to give your group health stones before the key starts. So you already get access to the 3 best health stones of every dungeon without needing to have a Warlock in the group. So when you think about how great health stones are, you have to consider that the Warlock doesn't even bring the best health stones because you can carry them into the dungeon still. And that is just something I was thinking about, since that was some of the feedback that I was getting on those tier list videos in favor of Warlocks. Again, here we had some ticks spawn, not ideal. You can blind the ticks and they will despawn before the blind breaks, which is a nice little thing to do if you can get them out at range there. So you'll see I blinded one of those blood ticks. Another one of them did manage to get in though, and they cause like a bleed to stack up on the tank, but more importantly, when they die, they explode. And so both of those things in combination can be pretty lethal to either the tank or the group. And it slows down your boss damage. Although, with our composition, it actually does increase our boss damage because I'm playing an Outlaw Rogue, and I can turn on my Blade Flurry and get some wit stacks whenever there is a tick around. So it might be a boss kill speed increase to do that. Anyways, here we're moving on to the next tantrum. Everybody's kind of using their defensives. I am in very little danger of dying to any given tantrum, even without receiving any healing. The combination of Feint and Crimson Vial make it so that it's very hard for me to die. But other specs, like Cynic, when he doesn't have Karma up, is in huge danger of dying if he doesn't receive a lot of healing. And so it's important that he uses his health potion and his health stone in a staggered way. And whenever Ardent doesn't have Rapture, Cynic is committing those sorts of cooldowns. I think he also has Dampen available too. Fact can sit in Ice Block for one of these too. And he has an Ajara Staff, so worst case, he can proc his Ajara Staff if he falls below 10% health, and that will heal himself and everybody else pretty much up to full at this point. Ajara Staff is like this ticking time bomb that's just slowly gaining in power, and he would really prefer not to use it for healing value on this fight, but it's nice that we have access to it in case we do get in the spot where we're dying to this fight. He can save us all, basically. I'm just going to let that tick spawn. I didn't think I was going to get to it in time, and the boss is fairly low on health here. So we're just going to attack the boss. My blind isn't available, otherwise I would probably just blind the tick. But again, it actually is a single target increase for me to be able to cleave off of it. Stomping on these little ticks during the charge is pretty important to do. Depending on which healer spec you have, they are often able to do it. Resto Druids, for instance, are very good at just running over all those while throwing out some rejuves. Discipline Priest, a little bit less interested in moving there outside of their penance. They really would rather stand still. And so the rest of the group has to do a little bit more of the movement to stomp on those ticks. Moving on now, we're going to be moving on to boss fights in pretty quick succession here. You see we got to 77% enemy forces before we engage that second boss, but this is the hardest pull in the dungeon. This Tide's Emissary is present on 2 out of the 3 beguiling patterns, but with teaming active, there's also a Death Speaker here. Luckily, we do have Ring of Peace available, so we can Ring of Peace out the Tides and avoid getting in combat with it if we do it right. So I'm spamming Sap on it to increase the reliability of this, and Fax is also polymorphing it. We don't even use our Ring of Peace actually in this run. Okay, we should have done that because you can avoid having to chain polymorphs on it or whatever. But we got in combat with everything. Fax is now going to spam polymorph on the Tides, and we're going to keep that Death Speaker shackled. We needed to wait for the Death Speaker to move away from the Tides' aura before we started putting CCs on it. And now we're kind of on a race against the clock. Because we have Fax in here with a ranged kick, we are on a tight timer. We need to kill this Defiler before its 4th cast. Otherwise, we're not going to have a kick for it. We will have enough kicks for the other Defiler, but one Defiler needs to die before it gets to its second Shadow Bolt volley, or fourth total cast of the dungeon. With this Death Speaker, we're just going to interrupt it, and then we're going to bring in the Tides and bring it right onto the boss. It's okay if the Death Speaker here gets some casts of Raise Dead while it's uninterruptible. It's not ideal, because then we'll have to deal with Wicked Frenzies as well, but it's not the end of the world. However, I'm a gamer, so I do have a way to stop this from happening to us. And you can see here, I think you'll see it as soon as this Death Speaker tries to cast Raise Dead, I'm gonna do a pro gamer move against this. So I use an Engineering Knock Belt to send the Tides away from the Death Speaker, and then I can kick the Death Speaker because it's no longer in the Tides' aura. And doing that is going to save a lot of damage from being on us here, and should let us get through before the Death Speaker's next cast, and avoid having to deal with an extra Guardian on top of the Death Speaker. Death Speakers are a lot more lethal when there are other Guardians nearby, because then they'll put their Wicked Frenzies on them. This boss fight is also one that causes some problems if you don't have immunities in your group. Having access to my Cloak of Shadows is a pretty big game for us, because it means that if we ever mess up on destroying mushrooms, I can just run around and get them with my Cloak of Shadows. We also have some disease dispels, so if there are a couple of oopsies, and we have the balls hitting people, they can just get dispelled, and that saves a lot of health. It's also nice that we have one of those on a DPS spec, so if there's a big, healer panic moment, Cynic can help out and do a big healing global by casting his Detox. And if we need to, we can also then soak individual mushrooms. We can just say, hey, I'm about to soak a mushroom, get ready to dispel me, and then soak a mushroom if there's just one out of place, and we don't have to commit something like Cloak of Shadows if there's only a couple of mushrooms that need some help here. So here you see I'm just using my cloak to take care of a big patch of mushrooms that was not going to go soaked. And now we have to be a little bit more careful. Our shields are down while my cloak is unavailable, so we're going to have to do a little bit more aggressive soaking and dispelling of people if we mess up the upheavals. It is possible to get all of the mushrooms without using anything except upheaval and shockwave, but the problem with that is that means that you probably have to run away from the boss and plan out exactly where you're dropping the upheaval. So you wouldn't be able to do this thing that I'm doing of sprinting out and jumping back in. And this is something that would cost you uptime on the boss. So we decide that it's better to generally have more uptime on the boss and slightly less precise mushroom killing, because we have access to the dispels. So if we mess up a couple mushrooms, we can just eat them and dispel them. If your group composition has a very hard time and needs to get all those mushrooms, if you don't have disease dispels, for instance, and you don't have Cloak of Shadows available, then I would recommend doing it differently. I'd recommend making sure that your melee go way far away as soon as they're targeted with upheaval, and optimize killing as many mushrooms as possible and minimizing those single mushroom stragglers that can be a bit of a problem. So making sure that you kind of want to clear in a space that's next to a space that's already cleared to make sure that you aren't creating these small patches of unsoaked mushrooms that would then be inefficient to kill with future upheavals. But again, because we have so much coverage in our group, it's okay if we do these inefficient mushroom clears. The most important thing is just to maximize uptime on the boss, because that's what's going to beat the timer as well as possible here. Let's talk a little bit about my spec. I know some people watching this content are still interested in learning about Rogue, and you may be interested in the talent build and stuff that I'm running. You can see all the talents and essences that I'm using up in the top left of the screen. You can see I'm running 3 copies of the Ace Up Your Sleeve trait, 1 Brigand's Blitz, 1 Blightborn Infusion, and 1 Keep Your Wits About You. This isn't the optimal setup. I'd rather be using something like 3 Deadshot, 1 Ace, 1 Blightborn, 1 Wits. That would be my setup if I could choose any combination of Azurite pieces. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to choose any combination of Azurite pieces. You have to deal with what the game gives you. You can see Cynic here has had a little bit of an oopsie, and so I'm battle resing him. One thing our comp is lacking is good battle reses, but I'm actually the best battle res in this group because I can cloak and cheat death or whatever while I'm B-resing to get somebody up, but we don't have any druids, so the lack of battle res means that we're going to be in big trouble if something bad happens and somebody dies in a void zone of some kind. But luckily Cynic there died in the middle of the room, so it was pretty easy for me to get him up. Anyways, as I was saying, the Azurite's not perfect. One nice thing about it is that it's got 3 copies of Overwhelming Power, which is pretty good. The defensive traits I have on it aren't great. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend going for this Azurite, but it's the best that I feel I have access to. Because I'm playing that Brigand's Blitz trait, which again, is not something that I love. I'd rather not be playing a Brigand's Blitz if I could avoid it, but it's against an even worse trait. Because I am playing it, I'm playing the Vision of Perfection minor essence, but if I didn't have that, I'd probably want to play Purification Protocol in this place. Purification Protocol I think is always pretty good. It's especially good in the Underrot though, because there are some aberrations, and it does extra damage to aberrations, so that's a nice thing that you get there. Okay, so the boss goes down. We have 8 minutes and 50 seconds left on the timer. We're going to deal with this worm first. We're just giving it a quick blind. Okay, we're not going to deal with it first. We're going to blind it. We're going to deal with it later. First, we're going to do Defiler. then we're going to bring everything onto one worm, and then we're going to bring everything onto another worm. So the Defiler here is the hardest part, the part that is most kicks required, and most coordinated kicks required. It's very important to get all those Shadow Bolt volleys and Withering Curses dealt with. So we're going to make sure that we deal with it first, and then we're going to bring this pack of mobs back onto the worm. The worm is stunnable, so it's a little bit less hectic. You can just handle it by throwing a big Between the Eyes on it or gouges or whatever, whereas the Defiler can only be knocked. It can't be stunned or whatever, so the only counterplay we'd have to it would be like a knock belt, and we already used a lot of our group's knock belts because we did that earlier when we brought the Tide's Emissary onto the boss that we just fought. So we're going to deal with this worm as the priority target here, and then once that dies, we'll take all these skeletons onto another worm. The next worm that we're going to bring these onto doesn't spawn except on teaming weeks, so you don't have to worry about that for your runs, except for when there is teaming active. But this week there was teaming active, so we're going to bring these mobs on over and take care of the worm real quick. You'll notice there's a Void-Touched Emissary over there. A lot of groups think that Void-Touched Emissary pulls with the skeletons, but it actually does not. There are some skeletons that you can pull that won't aggro the Void. A general rule of thumb for emissaries is that if you pull the mob that is farthest away from the emissary, it will not necessarily pull the emissary. So I would try that out anytime you're like looking at a pack and you're like, I really wish I didn't have to fight this emissary with this pack. There's a good chance that you don't have to. And even if you do have to, you can often fix that with Ring of Peace. So that's something worth considering if you do have a monk in your group. Like that earlier spot where we fought the Tides, you actually can deal with that without... You can not even aggro the Tides if you use Ring of Peace correctly there, which we didn't do at the time, but we did do in later runs this same week of this dungeon. These two Corruptors, we would be pulling onto a worm if we had gotten the good RNG at the start of the dungeon and we hadn't had to fight a Void Emissary, because the worms give the same count as Void Emissaries. So we would just be pulling these two back onto the nearest worm. That would be how we would be making up for the count that we were missing from that Void Emissary. But because we fought that Void Emissary, we don't have to do that, so we're just going to fight them by themselves here before going into the last boss. These are pretty lethal enemies. Both the Tentacles and the Maddening Gaze are one-shots in a high key, so those need to be dodged very effectively. The main thing to do is just make sure after each Abyssal Reach cast that you move not only away from where you were, but away from where anybody else is. So I like to always be kind of looking at the map and picking out an empty spot that I'm going to move to when they finish their cast, and I just move there. I'm like, okay, nobody was here, so the tentacles aren't slamming here, so I'm safe to move there. And then you just have to watch the enemies to see where they're casting their Maddening Gaze, which is something that unfortunately Cynic failed to do on that cast and did go down. But that's okay, we got another B-Res. I'm throwing a B-Res at him. We have one thing to do in a group composition like this. I see this actually happen fairly often. When you don't have good battle reses in your group, you should be more liberal with just using your battle reses anytime you might need to. Because, you know, even though we technically have access to 2 battle reses right now, it's tough to imagine a fight going wrong badly enough that we need to use 2 battle reses, and yet having it not be bad enough that we can get away with using our 4-second cast channeled battle res that requires us to be in melee range. So since that's true, our battle reses are a little bit less of a, you know, commodity worth saving, and a little bit more things that we should just use any chance we get to use our bad battle reses and get some value out of them. If we had a Resto Druid in the group, things would be different, and we would instead, like instead then we'd be in the spot where as long as the Resto Druid lives, we have all the battle reses. They're easy to use, they're instant cast, they're far ranged, and we should save them because they could save us from a wipe. But that's a little bit less realistic with this comp. One thing you'll notice here is that the boss like glows really bright, and the whole room glows really bright. Sometimes that's Crucible of Flame rank 4 does that in this room in particular. I don't really know why, but something to do with this room. Every single time that Ardent throws his Crucible rank 4 at the boss, it's just going to light up the whole room in a weird azurite blue-yellow glow thing. So that's something to look forward to. This boss is one that we've learned a little bit more about how it behaves. There are a couple of little tricks that I will now teach you. One thing that groups do is they sometimes are surprised when the boss vomits and there's goop in a spot that they didn't expect. The reason that happens is if the boss is aimed at a wall that's too close to it, the goop will bounce back off the wall. So it's very important to make sure that you're not aiming the boss at a wall. So here, for instance, if we were aiming the boss over at this wall and then trying to run this way, it could bounce off the wall and back at us. So instead, we always aim the vomits away from the wall. And that way, they're kind of aimed backwards, but we make sure to tilt them towards the middle of the room rather than towards the edges of the room to stop those bounces from being a problem. One other thing that's worth noting on this boss is that sometimes you're going to get to these spots where you don't get a cleansing light for a really long time. The reason this happens is that the friendly Titan Keeper casts those cleansing lights, but he'll get distracted if there are the little lads around and he needs to go kill those, and he'll interrupt his own cast of it. So you need to make sure that you're like saving defensives and things like Mass Dispel if we have that, or Cloak of Shadows for me to drop my stacks, those sorts of things, for if that happens. That's the reason that you'll notice that happens sometimes in groups. One other thing worth noting, this is one of the absolute worst fights in the game with Volcanic active. There's just huge amounts of volcanoes spawning because all the spores that are far away spawn those. Another thing you might notice if you look at the DPS meters is that Fax is doing 147k DPS here. That's because his Ajara, he procced his Ajara staff, and each of those spores only has 1 health, but they all get overkilled. He did like 500,000 damage to each spore, and it all shows up on the damage meters. So that one Ajara staff proc is just like all his. It's not all his damage. I think he might still be top damage without it, but it's definitely about 100,000 of his DPS on this fight. So that's going to distort the meters at the end of this dungeon, and in this fight in particular. So watch out for that. It's not. Fire Mage is very strong. It does a lot of damage, and Ajara staff also does a lot of damage, but a huge amount of that was overkilling these spores on this fight. So just bear that in mind when you're seeing the damage at the end here. One cool thing as well about this fight is that the boss actually goes below 30% health if you have a Demon Hunter in your group, giving it Chaos Brand, because it takes magic damage when when the ads die. And that's really good news, because if you don't have the Chaos Brand, the boss here would be at 33% health, and Fact wouldn't be able to Scorch off of it. But with the Chaos Brand, the boss goes below 30% health, and Fax can Scorch off of it. And that's a really useful thing for a couple specs in the game. Like if you want your Dribbling Ink pods to proc on the boss, if you want people to be able to, Scorch off of it, those are really useful things to have. So if you're wondering why sometimes the boss goes below 30% health and sometimes it doesn't, it's the Chaos Brand. Anyways, that's been Underrot plus 22. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.